A ceasefire on whose terms? The leadership in Ethiopia's rebel region of Tigray setting those terms for a truce in reply to what government forces bill as a unilateral cessation of hostilities. It's also what aid groups worry may in fact be a siege, with aid blocked, the internet cut for that restive region. 1.7 million displaced now face a food crisis, up to 400,000 the potential of famine. Last November's launch of an offensive against Tigray by 2019 Nobel Peace Laureate Abiy Ahmed has not gone to plan, neither for the Prime Minister nor for his Eritrean allies and the Amhara militias, who covet disputed land and fear a return to the days when Tigray enjoyed outsized power in a federal Ethiopia under longtime strongman Meles Zenawi. Will Meles's TPLF sit down with Abiy or try to march on Addis? Do Tigrayans want their autonomy or independence? And what now for Africa's second most populous nation, a continental powerhouse where civilians most certainly do not want an all-out civil war? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at what's been a week that was a turning point in Ethiopia's Tigray region. Joining us from Addis Ababa, Samuel Getachew, journalist, is with us there. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
From Las Vegas, Nevada, Faven Girmay, representative for the advocacy group Omna Tigray. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
From Rome, Laetitia Bader, senior researcher at Human Rights Watch. Thanks for joining us as well.
Thank you.
And we're joined here in the studio by sociologist Roland Marchal, senior fellow at the French National Research Center, the CNRS. How are you?
Thank you. Thank you.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. A unilateral ceasefire. It was exactly a week ago. Our attention was squarely on Ethiopia's first general election since Abiy Ahmed came to power. At the same time, government forces were pulling out of Mekelle, the Tigrayan capital, where late last week what are claimed to be government soldiers were marched through town towards the Mekelle Rehabilitation Center. Samuel Getachew, what was the reactions in the capital to those images?
It was shock. It was a huge surprise, obviously. But, I spent some time in the Tigray region. I traveled a few times during the conflicts and even before. And what I've seen, I'd like to focus on the humanitarian issues. Because the conversation I had with everyday Ethiopians who reside in the Tigray region was overwhelming. When the world begins to see the numbers behind the faces, we'll begin to understand what the impact of conflicts. There has been endless conflicts within Ethiopia for many, many years, even before I was born. And what I've seen, what I've heard was so overwhelming. But again, nobody celebrates. Nobody should be celebrating the death of any human beings. But the number seems to be high, and I've experienced a glimpse of what conflict is for the first time in my life in the Tigray region. And again, it's really, really, really sad. And I don't think anyone should be celebrating, whether it's you're either side. You can be on either side. But the fact is people are dying, and we have to focus on the humanitarian side of this conflict.
We've had mixed messages from Ethiopia's leader. At first, he said that he'd withdrawn because it was no longer strategic. In Parliament this Monday, the Prime Minister claiming that in 1 to 3 weeks, 100,000 trained, armed, and organized special forces, quote, can be mobilized. He added, if said special force isn't enough, if a militia is needed, 500,000 militiamen can be organized, 1 million youths can be mobilized in trains, but officials have decided there should be a period of silence for everyone to think. Faven Girmay, how do you interpret it when you hear the Prime Minister talk about a period of silence?
Well, first, I do think it's important to note that the unilateral ceasefire came at the heels of a series of major military defeats. Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed used the premise of humanitarian aid as a means for making this declaration, but in reality, it was a bruise to his ego, and it was an attempt for the Ethiopian government to both save face and cut its resources. The claim that 100,000 special forces can kind of be able to go to Tigray at any time is also indicative of the fact that he's not committed to a true humanitarian ceasefire, especially because the government has all but instituted a policy of weaponized starvation. We've seen that, as you mentioned, currently over 400,000 Tigrayans are facing famine, are actually in the brink of famine. An additional 2 million are facing famine. Eritrean forces and Amhara regional forces, who are responsible for the most egregious atrocities against Tigrayan civilians, are still engaged actively in the western part and northern parts of Tigray. And given that they're allied forces, the communication blackout, we are unsure what atrocities and exacerbation of the humanitarian crisis that these forces are doing on the ground. So it's clear that the Prime Minister is committed to continuing not only the weaponized starvation, but the destruction of the Tigray region.
Roland Marchal, do you think the Prime Minister is committed to a campaign of war, or that there is a genuine hope that there can be some kind of beginning of political talks?
Okay, we have to have hope, but yes, this announce of a ceasefire might be just a way to winning time and reorganize and see what happened. The question is, the Prime Minister will have to show his good faith by providing something new, greater, easier access, humanitarian access to international NGOs. Certainly, more serious discussion about the control of the Amhara militias and the Eritrean forces, and maybe as well the opening of, let us say, informal or secret talks with an expression of the TPLF. Now, the TPLF may be over-ambitious and overestimate his own victory. That could be a problem. We heard different statements that are not very encouraging on one side. On the other side, there is sure Abiy Ahmed is just waiting for the result of the national elections, and maybe the Prosperity Party may get such a victory that he believes that the population is very much behind him, which of course will push him to go back to a much tougher policy.
We're going to get back to that point of what the TPLF's next move is, but let me first ask you, Laetitia Bader, at this point in time, what's the situation when it comes to accessing aid this Monday? Is the internet back? Is telephone service back? Is electricity back in Tigray?
Well, I mean, just before coming into the studio, I was seeing reports that potentially electricity had been partially restored. But what is needed now is a lifting of all the restrictions on communications, on the internet, on electricity. This is going to be absolutely critical for the humanitarian community to be able to respond and really respond at the level that is required right now. And I think coming back to this whole discussion of a humanitarian ceasefire, it's important to underline that a ceasefire should not have been necessary for there to be unimpeded humanitarian access. And now it's absolutely key that all the warring parties are showing that they are truly committed to, first of all, restoring communications, restoring access routes, both air routes, road routes, so that the humanitarian response can start today. I mean, I think it's important once again to go back to the very alarming warnings that we were hearing a month ago about the fact that already 1/3 of 1 million people in Tigray were already starving. That was a month ago. So the response really needs to start now, and this needs to happen by all the parties to the conflict. And just a point there, I mean, I think we have repeatedly shown, and many organizations have also highlighted, how actions by the warring parties have deliberately resulted in the humanitarian crisis we're talking about today.
Yeah, there's a lot of finger pointing on both sides. On the hashtag F24 debate, viewers, for instance, asking about, well, what could be child soldiers in images filmed by Finnish national broadcaster YLE. This is at a Tigrayan rebel camp. When you look at those images there, Roland Marchal, in that report, by the way, fighters boasting about the youth joining the armed struggle. Your reaction when you see very young people, they look like they're underage in those images.
Yes, indeed. I remember the 1980s actually, where when this problem was as well quite huge among forces fighting the Derg, and whether on the Eritrean or the Ethiopian side. And this should be a concern, as well as the way prisoners of war are treated by TDF these days. And again, I do not believe that humanitarian conditions or concerns are only humanitarian. They just prove that a political dialogue is possible, and again, is worth taking the risk of.
Is it a repeat of the 1980s when starvation was a weapon of war?
Yes, starvation was used, and displacement of population was used by all in order to prove to the international community that really the Derg was criminal, and indeed he was. Maybe the other side wasn't as innocent as some thought at that time. The point today is how could we repair this situation, save people, but as well, build the conditions, the confidence, so that a discussion, a conversation could start as quickly as possible and stop the war dynamic, as well as try to envision what kind of conditions would be necessary for a full dialogue among the different parties. And of course, a resolution, a solution that do not put the whole population in such a situation.
Samuel Getachew, when you see how caustic the rhetoric is on social media and in public pronouncements, you get the sense that neither side seems to want to really sit down at this point.
Before I answer your question, let me reflect on my time in the Tigray region. I remember traveling to Aksum and stopping by. We saw this older lady. I was with German TV, and we stopped and we had a conversation with her. And she took us to her village. And what she reflected was, most of her animals, at least some of her animals, were chopped, like they chopped parts of the body of the animals. So she won't be in a position to feed herself, to farm, and be given the right to feed her family and her kids, her grandkids. And those are the memories I have of traveling to the Tigray region. Everything when it comes to the Tigray region has become a wedge issue. When it comes to Ethiopian politics, we're expected to follow the lines of maybe our ethnic backgrounds. But, the insults that has been going back and forth between the leadership of TPLF and the Ethiopian government leads me to believe that this conflict is far from over. They're sending all kinds of accusations and insults. The UN is coming in the middle saying they're going to investigate. But I don't think the world cares about Black people enough to investigate and have enough resources to do a proper investigation. And I don't think Ethiopia is in a position or has the resources to investigate. But what has happened in the Tigray region without taking sides or making accusations is overwhelming. It's really, really sad. When we looked at the Rwanda experience of 1994, we were supposed to take a lesson from it. I don't think the world has taken a lesson, and we're all guilty of it.
All right. Last week's announcement of that unilateral withdrawal by the government forces was followed late last week with alarming news of several destroyed bridges over the Tigray River. The UN's World Food Programme, in a strongly worded statement, announcing that even prior to the destruction, the agency's aid was being held up, a claim staunchly rejected in Addis Ababa.
The insinuation that we are trying to suffocate the Tigrayan people by denying humanitarian access and using anger as a weapon of war is beyond the pale. This is absolutely no reason for us to do so. These are our people.
So, Feiven Girmay, when you respond to that, How do you step away from it being, again, this caustic rhetoric where it's one side says it's all the other side's fault?
Well, I think we have to look at who has a history of impeding humanitarian access throughout the course of this war, and that is the Ethiopian government. The Ethiopian forces, along with their allies, both the Eritrean forces and the Amhara regional forces, have left a trail of scorched earth. They've burned crops, they killed livestock, they've consistently looted emergency aid that was intended to go to the Tigray region. They have blocked aid agencies from reaching the most devastating parts of the region. We saw Abiy Ahmed consistently demonize humanitarian workers, after which 3 MSF workers were killed, 2 of which were Tigrayan. We saw most recently that 4 tons of humanitarian aid was blocked from reaching Western Tigray. So what we see here is a consistent pattern by the Ethiopian government to withhold aid and essentially starve the people of Tigray. The idea that, also I do want to make note that the aid agencies reportedly attributed the bombing of the Tekeze Bridge to Amhara special forces. So the idea that the TDF forces, who've consistently asked for unfettered humanitarian aid and who have stock in the livelihoods of the Tigrayan people, would be responsible for the bombing of the bridge, is preposterous. Also, we also have to look at the consistent lies that this administration has told since the beginning of this war. Remember, they indicated that Eritrean forces were no longer present in Tigray. They indicated just 2 weeks ago that there was no hunger in Tigray, despite the fact that the UN and USA Aid have consistently reported contrary to that fact.
Laetitia Bader, when you think back to November the 4th, when this offensive was launched, did you see all this coming?
I mean, we didn't see much because, as we've been also experiencing in the last week or so, there was a communication shutdown. The internet was shut down. So we were very much in the dark for 6 weeks. I mean, we started to get a sense of the true magnitude and tragedy of what had unfolded in the first 2 months. So in the initial offensive, particularly in Western Tigray, by traveling to Sudan and meeting with tens of thousands of refugees that had fled predominantly from Western Tigray at the time. Could we have expected what came next? No. The magnitude, the gravity, the horrors that Samuel was pointing to, and Haben as well, were not expected. But there is now ample evidence of the severity of the abuses, of the deliberate nature of a lot of the atrocities we have been documenting, both in terms of targeting of the male and boy population for killings in reprisal massacres, notably in the historic time of Aksum in late November, but we have repeatedly received similar credible reports of such reprisal killings throughout the fighting and to date. At the same time, widespread reports of sexual violence by women and girls. And of course, I think it's important to underline again and again that what we are talking about are just the reported cases. This is also a conflict which has seen, as Médecins Sans Frontières has described, the deliberate attacks on medical facilities, on health facilities. So what we are talking about in terms of reported cases is just the tip of the iceberg.
And we're going to be looking at one of those examples of medical facilities being attacked with an exclusive report when we come back. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're at what some have called a turning point for Tigray, which is home to a little more than 5% of Ethiopia's population. It had outsized power during the long reign of Meles Zenawi. It was the subject of an attack by government forces and the Eritrean army at the beginning of November, and it's taken back its regional capital last week. We're talking about it with, from Addis Ababa, journalist Samuel Getachew, from Las Vegas, Nevada, Faith Ngirme, representative of the advocacy group Omna Tigray, from Rome, Laetitia Bader, senior researcher at Human Rights Watch, and sociologist Roland Marchal, senior fellow at the French National Research Center, the CNRS. Yeah, up to 400,000, we were stating it in part one of our discussion, face the immediate threat of starvation. France 24 correspondent Maria Girth-Nicolescu went to Tigray and filed this report.
2 months ago, this man lost everything. At the heart of Tigray's mountains, Eritrean soldiers massacred residents in his village. These graves, built in the hollow of a cliff, are the only visible trace of the killing.
My wife was called Hawa. She was a mother of 5. 1 month ago, she gave birth to a baby. We also had daughters. Their names were Tesla, Zuvan, and Rael. We were not able to pray for them because we had to run for our lives.
19 people were killed in one day.
On that day, there were many Eritrean soldiers. They were uncountable. As they were passing through this area, people were simply staying in their homes. The soldiers brought all the residents together and then killed them all here.
Since the beginning of the conflict, Eritrean soldiers have been backing the Ethiopian army against dissident Tigrayan forces. Many witnesses accuse Eritreans of having massacred and raped civilians throughout the region. Like here, most rural areas are difficult to access for NGOs. Because of the war, this medical team is often forced to return to the regional capital, Mekelle, and even when there's no fighting, its movements are restricted.
Today we planned to go to a village and people were expecting us. But on the way there we were stopped at a checkpoint by Ethiopian soldiers. They turned us back even though we told them we were going to treat women and children. We're very worried about people in remote villages without access to healthcare.
The team finally stops in this small village in central Tigray. People here have been in dire need of medical assistance ever since the local clinic was attacked.
This center was treating patients until mid-January, but then the Ethiopian military destroyed it. They took everything and tore it apart. Over there is the fridge. They broke it and left it. They threw out children's vaccines and medicines so that they're now unusable.
In these rural areas, accessing medical treatment has become extremely difficult. Even food is now difficult to find. Children especially are suffering from malnutrition.
I measured 11.4. It's a decrease, so I'm giving you a form that will entitle you to special food.
Because of a shortage of ambulances, some women die in labor, like this baby's mother 3 months ago. For the past days, the family has been unable to find milk. Her aunt feeds her ground cereal.
We're going to weigh her. We found this baby by chance. If we'd come later, we could have easily missed her. There are many babies just like her, and their mothers don't have milk. These children are too underweight, and what we give them won't be enough to save them.
The town closest to the village is deserted, and its economy at a standstill. To help those most in need, some organizations, sometimes supported by the government, are trying to distribute wheat and seeds.
We have planned to distribute about 2,900 quintal of seeds, which is used for 12,780 farmers. We are in distributed to the most vulnerable people, but it is not covers to the whole our people.
The unilateral ceasefire declared by the government on June 28th could come as a relief amid an alarming humanitarian situation. According to the UN, 350,000 people are facing famine in Tigray.
Laetitia Bader, you heard in part one of our discussion Samuel Getachew warning that the international community isn't going to step in for this. Nonetheless, we have seen strongly worded statements, both by the European Union and by the United States, denouncing this blocking of access to aid. What's the next step for the international community?
Yeah, I mean, the messaging and the alarm bells have definitely increased, but it is in many ways very late, I would argue. And I think this is something which has come up again and again in our interviews with survivors, victims, communities on the ground in Tigray is really this sense of being abandoned, first of all, by the federal government. This was something which we heard very clearly in December last year at the beginning of the conflict, but much more recently has been this sense of being abandoned by the world. And so I think what needs to happen now is very clear, is that wording is positive, but there needs to be much more concrete action. So we saw on Friday the first public meeting at the level of the Security Council on Ethiopia, on the situation in Tigray, but that needs to become a standing agenda item at the level of the UN Security Council, and it needs to go hand in hand with concrete actions. Now is not the time to be dilly-dallying. Now is the time for there to be a clear message from a whole range of actors. It's absolutely key for the African Union leadership and individual African leaders on the continent to express their alarm with the situation on the ground, to put pressure with all actors involved to ensure at a minimum that there is unimpeded humanitarian access at the moment, but also that there are real investigations on the ground. I think coming to the whole question of investigations, it's going to be key for everyone to allow independent UN monitors to do an international investigation on the ground. It is critical right now that warring parties, notably those that are also moving and pulling out of the region, are not destroying key evidence, including evidence of massacres, which is something we are very concerned about. But it's also really key for the international community to start talking about what accountability needs to look like.
Feiven Girmay, we've heard both sides express distrust in the United Nations. So if there is going to be substantive talks, who's going to broker them?
Well, I think first, the AU has expressed a willingness to broker negotiations. Also, Sudan has also indicated their willingness to broker negotiation. What essentially the TPLF, the Tigray government, has been asking for are negotiations since the start of this war. However, the Prime Minister has refused to do so. It was only, like I said earlier, a month ago that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs gawked at the possibility of potential ceasefire. But after military defeat is when the Tigray government has essentially forced their hand. So I think America also has expressed a willingness to broker peace talks, which I believe the Tigray government would be more than welcome up.
And to have talks, you need to have both sides willing to come to the table. Debretsion Gebremichael, who is the leader of the TPFL, who'd been lying low for months, telling the New York Times that, of course, Tigrayans have to fight back when attacked. As for marching on Addis or Asmara, the capital of neighboring Eritrea, where strongman Isaias Afewerki has been in power since independence in 1991, he says, quote, "We have to be realistic. Yes, we would like to remove Isaias, but at the end of the day, Eritreans have to remove him." Roland Marchal, Debretsion Gebremichael is now re-emerged from the hills. Is this now going to be the broker that sits down with Abiy Ahmed, or is this
actually
Redux 1991?
Actually, he was one of the TPLF leaders who wanted to have a warmer relations with Abiy Ahmed at first in 2018. And therefore, yes, he could have been the man of this renewed negotiation with Addis Ababa. I'm not sure today he is as influential as he used to be in the past, and I think Abiy Ahmed missed a real opportunity to have a genuine negotiation. Now going to...
if he's not as influential, then who's running the show in Tigray?
I believe today those who are the military wing and the militarists among the military wing are certainly the most influential. Yes, indeed.
And so, what's their plan? Right now? Is it
to free
to
Tigray,
fight the Amhara militias,
yeah,
to go to the Sudanese border?
Yeah. What is unclear is up to what extent they realize that history cannot repeat itself, except as a farce.
Yeah, just to remind our viewers here, in 1991, the regime of Mengistu Haile Mariam is toppled with the rebellion that starts in Tigray.
Yeah, Tigray, Eritrea, because their EPLF actually played a major role to weaken the Ethiopian army. OLF, the Oromo Liberation Front, was not very well organized as Tigray or TPLF or EPLF, but was extremely active. There were other smaller groups that existed. The regime itself in Addis Ababa was basically already collapsing. Mengistu actually escaped to Zimbabwe long before the regime collapsed in Addis Ababa.
And so you're saying history doesn't repeat itself?
No, I do not, and I hope that the Tigrayan leaders will understand that they shouldn't have those kind of hopes because that will bring destruction everywhere, and at the end of the day they will lose this war the same way others lost in the past.
Samuel Getachew, when you hear Roland Marchal say that right now in Mekelle, the capital of Tigray, if it's the military wing that has more sway, how does that bode?
Well, you can never discount the leader of the face of the struggle that just happened. The president of TPLF, while he has been declared as a terrorist, he is welcomed by activists. We can never deny the fact that that's who he is. He has become the face of what happened. And the triumph that happened in Mekelle. That's a fact. But the reality is, while your guest talks about history, what worries me the most is that even today, people are dying in many, many parts of the Tigray region. And, to be honest, I'm not trying to discount what's happening in the Tigray region. What's been happening is all over Ethiopia. I came back to Ethiopia from Canada. I loved being in Canada. I was more interested in Canadian politics. But in the 4 years or the 5 years I've been to Ethiopia, the country has truly changed. It's been a roller coaster. It's been changing. There was hope at the beginning, but now...
A Nobel Peace Prize after the peace treaty with neighboring Eritrea in 2019.
Sure. I was on the first flight to Asmara. I enjoyed the history. I wanted to be part of the history. It was a moment of where were you when East Germany became independent or got freed? Was that moment for us. But things have changed, and it worries me the most. What worries me and my colleagues the most is that too many people are dying, and something needs to change in Ethiopia, and I'm just speaking from the heart.
Why did Abiy Ahmed launch this offensive?
I really don't know. I'm not a citizen of Ethiopia. It's a question you should ask Ethiopians. But from what I've seen, Ethiopia had problems long before he came to power. I used to travel all over Ethiopia. I was asked my ethnic background. More than my citizenship. There was times when I was attacked with my colleagues because they assumed I was, quote unquote, the wrong tribe. It began before him. I'm not obviously blaming anyone. I'm just stating a fact. So Ethiopians became more of an ethnic blocks than citizens. And that was the beginning of the problem to Ethiopia. And it was a problem that existed long before the prime minister came to power.
Feifen Girmay, on a previous show, there were some who resented how under Meles Zenawi this concept of ethnic federalism took hold, and saying that's part of the reason why today we have Tigrayans versus Amhara militias, and as we said, these regional rivalries that are more ethnic rivalries.
It's important to note that ethnic divisions predate the TPLF. It's actually been since the inception of modern-day Ethiopia. That dating back to Menelik, the forced colonization of the Oromo people, their persecution of over 5 million, the forced assimilation policies of Haile Selassie. So there have been the subjugation of varying ethnic groups, especially throughout history, the Nana, Shoa, Amhara ethnic groups that have not only predate TPLF, but have occurred throughout the course of Ethiopian history. So this notion that TPLF brought ethnic federalism and all of a sudden that's when Ethiopians became cognizant of their ethnic identity is ridiculous.
How do we step away from it now, though?
Well, first, it's a dialogue. A lot of historically subjugated and oppressed minorities, what they want is a stake in the political sphere. So the first thing that needs to happen are free dialogue and negotiations. Currently, we have a series of Oromo political prisoners. We have Tigrayans of both non-politicians being intimidated, persecuted, and arrested based solely on their ethnicity. These things need to come to an end, and there needs to be an inclusive dialogue amongst politicians and people from various ethnicities on next steps forward. Trying to force all of Ethiopians into a strong central unitary state is making them feel that they're going to lose all the benefits in terms of their linguistic rights, their cultural rights that they've been able to express during the TPLF regime and ethnic federalism. So we need to make sure that those rights are safeguarded, and that can only be done through an inclusive dialogue.
And what's the future for Tigray? Is it back to the status that it had before all of this happened? Is it more autonomy? Is it independence?
Well, I can't postulate what will happen. That's going to be dependent on the people of Tigray and the Tigrayan government who serves the people of Tigray on next steps forward. What I think is most important is that we address the humanitarian crisis because people are dying, starving to death. And that needs to be of most concern, both for the Tigray government, which I believe it is, but more importantly, for the central government, who has all but ignored the Tigrayan people and their suffering.
Laetitia Bader, when you look at right now the urgency that we've been repeating throughout this show, which is to get food to people, and you look at that map again, what's the best route right now? What's the best way to get the food in?
Well, I mean, all the routes need to be opened up right now, basically, in order to ensure that the scale of the scale up, basically, of the response that is required and necessary can happen. I mean, I think this is something that obviously you would need to discuss more with humanitarian actors, but it's pretty clear until possibly in the last 24 hours that most of those routes were blocked off. And so now they all need to open up to enable that scale up to happen. I think it's important to come back to the questions you were asking earlier to Fazen and to Samuel. I mean, one of the issues we've been raising again and again over the last 2 years, well, 3 years, I would argue, is that there is a need for avenues for grievances which exist, which are very real. And I think as other participants have mentioned, they have been around for decades, even longer. It's very clear that over the last decade, avenues for grievances to be expressed in a non-violent manner have repeatedly been restricted. And this happened, obviously, under the EPRDF, but it's also happened under the Abiy administration. And it's something we have been underlining again and again, the fact that, as Fazen just mentioned, much of the political, across the political spectrum, you currently have a number of key political leaders who are still lingering in detention at the moment, 1 year on from the arrest of a number of them, I mean, is a problem right now. So it's absolutely key for these commitments or questions about a moment of silence, of potential reflection, to actually go hand in hand with very concrete steps to show that people who have different opinions on the future of the country have a space to argue, to voice them. And I think, unfortunately, obviously, given what's been happening in the last 8 months, there are obviously other key actions and commitments which really need to be met by concrete actions right now. But this is a fundamental issue which needs to be resolved as soon as possible as well.
Roland Marchal, your thoughts on this before we go? Because
in 2005, EPRDF was very close to lose power. because he thought that he could actually allow elections to be organized, and then Meles Zenawi, and then opposition could express itself and so on. And then a couple of days before the election day, he found out that he was going to lose. Therefore, they rigged the election. They put in jail dozens of thousands of people. And then the EPRDF strategy changed radically. What they did was basically to multiply the number of the membership, so that they would control everything, not only middle and top level. They will control villages, on neighborhoods and so on, so that nobody could express a view that is a dissent against the government. This strategy has been successful to control the elections up to 2015, but what the end result of this was that the only way to express an opposition, even not radical opposition, was eventually to go to violence. And this, what has been happening for the last 6 years. And therefore, if you want to challenge this, to open a space, ways for people to find a way to claim what they believe is their right, you will need to not only to talk to the leadership, you will need to change the patterns of politics at the local level. And this really needs a leadership that I haven't seen, neither in TPLF for so many decades, nor in Abiy friends today in power in Addis Ababa. So I must say, personally, I feel this is an opinion more than an analysis, because my job is to analyze the past. But if I look the future, I'm actually not very optimistic about what may happen in Ethiopia.
All right, well, let's hope you're proved wrong, Roland
Yes,
Marchal.
I hope.
I want to thank you so much. I want to thank as well Samuel Getachew for being with us from Addis Ababa, Faven Girmay in Las Vegas, Laetitia Bader in Rome. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.